Okay, we're good.
Hey, everybody. This is the DMZ America podcast coming to you on a Thursday, November 7th, 2024. I'm editorial cartoonist Scott Stantis coming to you from the right.
And I'm editorial cartoonist Ted Rall coming to you from the left.
Now, none of this matters left, right, or center because one of the things we talk about and people seem interested is history. And Ted and I are almost Rayman-esque in our knowledge of the American presidency. At 24. Time for Wilson. And it's true. So obviously we had some kind of an election this past week, and Donald Trump is the second president we've had who will have had two non-consecutive terms. Donald Trump is the 45th and will be sworn in as the 47th president of the United States. But before him, there was Grover Cleveland. Cleveland was first elected in 1884, first Democrat elected in many years. He lost the election in 1888, and then
maybe
came
we should
back.
talk about why Democrats had not been elected for many years.
Well, there was a civil war, and the Democrats backed up, and the Copperheads and all that kind of badness has sort of creeped in. So the Republican Party was incredibly strong and incredibly large and in charge, starting in 1860, of course, with the election of Abraham Lincoln, going on with the two terms of Ulysses S. Grant, then the election of 1876, where hijinks ensued.
They did.
The election of 1880, which we saw James Garfield, who hated Mondays but loved lasagna, and then of course, then comes.
And he didn't like anarchists either.
Well, there's that,
or or his last doctors, but that's for another podcast.
Yeah, James Garfield died of an infection he should never in a million years have been. Died from the popular bestseller a few years back, The Fate of the Republic, kind of chronicles all of that, and it's
very
just
well worth reading for sure.
It really is, and you kind of have to wonder what kind of president Garfield would have been. I suspect he would have been quite good. He was actually a representative. He came out of the Congress, not the Senate.
He was a Republican also.
Well, that's what they all were until 1884. Well, okay, let's talk about very briefly the election of 1876, where Sam Tilden won really everything, and until
he was a judge from New York.
He was governor of New York.
Yeah,
and he defeated in the popular vote by a lot Rutherford B. Hayes, who probably had the manliest of beards. To be fair, it gets to the House of Representatives, and people start saying, the South, is it really America? Really? I mean, are we really going to go there? And it got contested. And of course, Tilden got, what's the word I'm looking for, Ted? Fucked out of the presidency. He stepped aside, which he shouldn't have done in hindsight.
No, he Al Gore'd it.
He did. And so now we go to, from 76, we go to 80. It was much clearer. It was Blaine versus Garfield. Garfield being
Blaine
a dark
was
horse.
a venal piece of shit.
You think so?
Yeah, kind of. Even though he fancied his, as we like to talk about it here offline, he called himself the Plumed Knight. But there was reason for that. But anyway, he was kind of a venal piece of shit.
Doesn't that sound like, again, I'm sorry, I guess maybe everything becomes sexual, but in our coarse culture, but it really does. You know what? I hear Ted. I saw him in the locker room. He's a plume knight.
Well, he should get a razor for that. Manscaping helps.
So we now go to the election of 1884. Grover Cleveland, governor of the great state of New York. He had previously been the very well-regarded mayor of Buffalo, New York. He rose to prominence because he was incredibly honest. And
in that way, by the way, there's a parallel here. Kathy Hochul, the current governor of New York, also is from Buffalo. Buffalo is not normally a locus of power in New York anymore.
No,
but don't laugh. It used to be. It was a very wealthy and prosperous city for a long time. It is not now. So when she ascended to the governorship a few years ago, following the Me Tooing of Andrew Cuomo, who may return, by the way, as mayor of New York City. To the political world next year. In fact, more likely than not. it was kind of like shocking because the locus of power in this state is New York City and Albany.
Yeah, I imagine Buffalo probably was a center of great wealth because it was shipping from the Great Lakes, which meant that timber,
it's
coal,
a great place to thrift,
minerals.
because the antiquing is great because people used to be rich. So there's a lot of really cool stuff.
We're really talking about antiquing right now? Really?
Sorry.
Anyway, so mayor of Buffalo, New York. He is honest as the day is long. He becomes governor of the state of New York, which puts you in line to be president of the United States. It's one of those high profile positions that I would say governor of Ohio. He runs against...
to be clear, at the time, not anymore.
Yes. Well, although I still think it probably has... Cuomo's dad was certainly a contender many years ago. So 1884, we see a race between Grover Cleveland
and James Blaine.
Yeah, the tattooed man, as he was drawn by Kepler of Puck fame, the satirical magazine in the United States, really the most popular satirical magazine, maybe the most popular illustrated publication in the country at the time. Very famous drawing of him as the tattooed man, and he had all the scandals attached to him. Blaine was also Speaker of the House, but he falls to Grover Cleveland. Now, Grover Cleveland, let's talk briefly about his policies. If Grover Cleveland were alive today, besides being, surprised, he would also be considered a libertarian. He pushed very hard for free trade, lower tariffs. And so his first term, Grover Cleveland, very successful. He even had a marriage in the White House. I'm laughing because we're looking at parallels. My guess, Ted, is that we're going to see the portrait of Grover Cleveland prominently displayed in the Donald Trump Oval Office.
Even though he was a Democrat.
Kinda. Not like you and I would.
Right. And by the way, that wouldn't be the first time. I mean, in Donald Trump's first term, he elevated Andrew Jackson to a place of prominence in the Oval Office, who, of course, founded the Democratic Party.
Yeah, well, actually, you could probably say Van Buren had more to do with it than Jackson. But Jackson dominated the party. He ran it for decades as president. After his presidency, James K. Polk owes the presidency to Jackson, but Jackson was a prick. Okay, let's be clear.
May have been psychotic.
Oh, I don't think there's any question. Fascinating historical tidbit about Andrew Jackson, and we'll move on. But there's a ton, but not least of which is when he gave his second inaugural address, not one person in the audience said they could understand what he was saying. You know why? He had one tooth in his mouth.
Oh.
Yeah.
So they call him Gummy Bear.
But he still had bite because
Andrew Jackson, of course, trashed the White House, which was pretty new at the time after being rebuilt after the British burned it down in the War of 1812, right? Like he invited all of his thousands of best friends for the inauguration to go into the White House, and they trashed the joint and stole everything. And
famous episode in The West Wing as they talk about the big Wheel of Cheese Day. Andrew Jackson, on his ascension to the presidency, was given a 2-ton wheel of cheese. It's a lot of cheese.
That's a reason enough for a Frenchman to run for president.
We've had one president who had French descent. Do you know who it was?
Ooh, I'm going to say, I'm guessing.
I'll give you a hint. 20th century.
Okay, thank you. Oh, it's not JFK.
Last half of the 20th century. I'll make it even better. Narrow the list.
Wow. LBJ, really?
Yeah, LBJ had some French blood in him, which explains why he was such a Lothario and such a dog. Which he really
they all were.
Yeah, but he was no, they weren't. Actually, they weren't.
Who wasn't?
Oh, I would say
Nixon wasn't.
Hayes wasn't.
Truman wasn't.
No. Coolidge was not.
True.
So, I mean, you can't ascend to that White House without being a lascivious
A
piece of
hound.
shit. Yeah,
That's
you really
true.
can.
Although it's unusual, it's exceptional.
It is. They have, these guys have appetites, huge appetites. With JFK, they always talk about how he had a lot of sex. If you look at the list of drugs he took to fight his Addison's disease, part of the treatment in the 50s and going into the early 60s was massive doses of testosterone. I mean, huge doses, dangerous doses. Testosterone, yes. And he was given this. And that makes you, as you might imagine, incredibly horny. And so, and he really, so he,
now I want to just do the big headline here, right? Because I feel like you and I, we have a tendency to go down all these rabbit holes. So, yes. So why are we talking about Grover Cleveland, right? So Donald Trump was president from 2017 to 2021. He obviously has not been president for the last 4 years. He's about to be president again from 2025 to 2029, assuming that we are all fortunate enough that he lives that long and finishes his term. And of course, Grover Cleveland's the only other president who did something similar. He was in for a term from starting in 1885. He was defeated for re-election in 1889. And
by Benjamin Harrison, the grandson of William Henry Harrison.
And returned in the Tippecanoe and Tyler too, and then returned triumphantly in 1893, just in time to watch the entire economy burst into flames, and then he retired in 1897. Yes.
But what's interesting,
and like Trump, he had an incredible reputation for probity and honesty.
Yes, exactly. The same quality. Well, here's the thing. He runs in 84. And the Republicans, to go after him, brought up or charged him or tried to whisper campaign that he had fathered a child out of wedlock. He had not been married up to that point. He was elected as a bachelor president, only the second one to do so after James Buchanan, someone who had never been married. Some of the presidents did ascend to the presidency after their wives had died. So
Thomas Jefferson,
Thomas Jefferson being one of them. Grover Cleveland, 1884, the Republicans come up with the slogan because in a smear campaign that he had fathered a child out of wedlock, and with the clever slogan of Ma, where's my pa? Gone to the White House. Ha, ha, ha. You can see it. In fact, it was here.
But that was a retort. That was a rejoinder to the Blaine forces who, right, they had their chant, wasn't it something along the lines of like, Ma, where's your pa? And it was like, sort of like, you abandoned. And then they said, off to the White House. The retort was, off to the White House. Ha, ha, ha. So it was a call and response kind of thing. It was like, fuck you, Democrat, fuck you, Republican assholes.
Well, to his credit, and even before this became
however, he was guilty of this.
Even before it became a national issue, he had taken responsibility and was paying for the child's.
Well, this wasn't anything. That's skipping an important part of the story about Grover Cleveland. I mean, Grover Cleveland first, before he ultimately took responsibility, but he was pressured into doing so. Right? He fathered a child out of wedlock with a woman who his supporters, and he stood by and let this happen. They smeared her as a woman of ill repute, as a woman of the night. She was actually a very reputable girl, and who considered him to be her boyfriend. She did not sleep around with anybody else, according to the people who knew her. And his supporters, and he was very powerful, arranged to have her sent off to a ladies' college run by I believe the Catholic Church. It might have been by a Protestant minister. But anyway, basically they tried to send her away to a nunnery and keep her away from the national media.
Get thee to a nunnery.
And they basically kept her hidden for a number of months, when even by the standards of the late 19th century and the patriarchy of the time, it was too much for the men who ran that institution. And they were like, this is ridiculous. It was a mental institution. They tried to have her condemned as insane. And it was like, well, and he was like, no, she's not insane. I'm letting her go. And then Grover couldn't. I don't know why does Grover Cleveland? I guess his honesty reputation had to do with like not taking bribes and It did not have to do with this
actually ferreting
This was
out
a sordid
corruption.
affair, right?
This was, and it was ugly, but don't forget, back in those days, women who were incarcerated were put in insane asylums if they actually had orgasms. So let's,
and rightly so.
Well, yeah, I mean, come on, that's all.
What's with that anyway? That's male business.
So, Mama, where's my pod? Grover Cleveland wins. He goes to the White House. Now, here's where the story gets very Trumpian. If you remember when Trump was running in in 2015, he was being interviewed and mentioned that if his daughter wasn't his daughter, he'd be trying to sleep with her, which was a really gross thing to say. Okay, I'm just throwing it out there. Grover Cleveland didn't just talk the talk. Grover Cleveland walked the walk. Friend of his, Folsom, passes away. Grover steps forward and says, he was my best friend. I'll take care of his kids. One of his kids was Frances Folsom. Frances was quite young, as you might imagine. He raised her as a ward. And then
she turned out to be quite fulsome herself.
In 1886, at the age of 49, he marries his 21-year-old ward.
Right. So he was the Woody Allen of his time.
He was the Woody Allen of his time. She actually became quite popular. She was quite pretty, as you might imagine, and became a bit of a cause célèbre across the United States. And many of the publications really didn't make a big deal out of the fact that he had married his de facto ward/daughter. I guess
they really didn't care. It wasn't that big a deal.
I guess. Well, it's one of those weird,
the public loved her. She was very popular. Yes. By all accounts. She was an erudite, charming, intelligent, sophisticated young woman. And there were, Scott and I both collect political ephemera. I have a medalette that depicts both Grover and his wife side by side, and there's many of them. You can get them on eBay. There's probably as many of those as there are Jew-gates of him with his vice presidential running mate.
Oh, that's funny. He was, for those of you who may not know, Grover Cleveland was also, up until William Howard Taft, the fattest president we ever had, with a big walrus mustache.
Mm-hmm.
So not anyone's idea of a prize. But there you have it. I guess, the heart wants what the heart wants, I guess.
The heart and other parts.
So he has a fairly successful first term. He gets married. The United States is at peace. The economy is doing fairly well. So then comes the election of 1888, and he's up against.
Well, it should be pointed out that that there were some controversies at that time. Right?
Okay.
It's hard to, of course, you know this well, Scott, but today it's almost outlandish to believe, but it's true that one of the great controversies economically in American domestic policy was the question of bimetallism, and whether America, which was then on the gold standard and would remain on the gold standard until 1933 and the beginning of the Great Depression, and FDR took us off. Partly, I would say, he recalled the gold, and then in 1972, President Nixon really put an end to it. But there were the followers of young William Jennings Bryan and other silver proponents thought that if we went on to the silver standard instead, that it would put more money in people's pockets. That the dollar would be, that basically it would be looser money. We'd borrow, the federal government would be able to raise more currency and
print more currency,
fund more social programs, which at that time there basically were hardly any. And so that was the big controversy. It started during Grover Cleveland's first term.
Right.
He was bubbling up. And tariffs, right? Another Trumpian.
Yes, that was
parallel.
Probably the bigger one. That and free trade.
Mm-hmm.
Grover Cleveland would, like I said, if he ran today, he'd probably be considered a libertarian.
Mm-hmm.
He believed in free trade. He believed in low tariffs. He believed in competition and the magic of the marketplace. My kind of guy. And there's also something interesting about his vice president, which we'll mention in a moment, that makes me really respect Grover Cleveland. But his economic policies really put a chill down the spine of the Southerners and also in the industrial belt, because he wanted free trade, and he lowered tariffs, which means goods made overseas could come into the country, and that consumers could buy them for relatively cheaply.
It also depressed American wages, and it hurt American manufacturing concerns.
Right, and which elicited the response and the growth of the People's Party, Ted Rall's kind of party. It was the poor farmers from the South, poor farmers from the Midwest, labor. It was just before. It was pretty much the prelude to the Socialist Labor Party, but there was the People's Party.
And briefly, for a hot second, the Populist Party came out of the same period.
Yeah, well, they were. It was the same thing, actually, considered the same thing. But so, 1888, he loses because of by a whisker. He wins the popular vote, loses the Electoral College.
Well, I should also say that he got the tariff policy was and the lack of protectionism was unpopular. The economy was starting to teeter. Cost of living was relatively high relative to depressed wages. Sound familiar? And the parallels are kind of amazing. And also, like President Trump and President-elect Trump, it's funny to say that they're both true at this stage, right? And you could only ever say that about someone. You could only say that about Grover Cleveland before.
Yeah, only
between 1889 and 1893.
If you were podcasting in the 1880s.
Yeah, well, this is a shout back to you guys. So he was also a committed anti-interventionist. He opposed military expansionism by the United States. He did not want the U.S. to be very involved in foreign countries' internal affairs. He withdrew from various treaties, and he was an anti-imperialist. And he basically wanted to focus on self-defense of the homeland. He wanted to build a wall. He had a board of fortifications in order to have a new coastal fortification system for the United States. His wall was going to be on the oceans.
How does that work?
Well, obviously, you've been to the beach, Scott. There's no wall. So
yeah, I have been to the East Coast, and there is no remnants of the Grover Cleveland
wall. Has not
wall.
happened. The
Grover's wall.
Grover's wall, which also would have really screwed up the whole beach fun at the beach thing. But it might have been good with climate change. It could have been very forward looking. To keep the rising oceans out. Anyway, I just think that's an interesting parallel.
That's fascinating. That is fascinating. So he loses in 1888 he wins the popular vote, loses the Electoral College to Benjamin Harrison. Quick side note on Benjamin Harrison, apparently was one of the best speech givers, I guess is the phrase, could deliver one of the best speeches in American history from the 19th century, which is a high bar. I mean, there are some great orators back then. And he was apparently a phenomenal orator. He was a wretched human being behind closed doors, apparently. Not bad, not a mean person or a bad person necessarily, but he was just, he had the worst handshake of any president, said someone who met him. It was in his presence in a room. He was very shy. It sounds very much like he may have been autistic. So Benjamin Harrison wins the election. Now we move to the election of 92.
Well, wait a minute. What did he do for 4 years? I mean, I one story that I love, and I don't know if this is true or not, is that basically when Mrs. Harrison, Mrs. Cleveland was leaving the White House. She was showing Mrs. Harrison around, and at one point, as she got ready to leave, she advised Ms. Harrison not to change too much because she and her husband planned to be back in 4 years.
Yeah, well,
and of course they were.
And there was a dip in the economy. Things didn't perform well.
A dip in the economy. It was one of the biggest economic catastrophes in U.S. history. The Panic of 1893 was absolutely just devastating.
No, we're talking about 88. Harrison is president of the United States.
Okay, all right.
Stay with me. Stop interrupting, young man.
Sorry.
Okay, 1888. Benjamin Harrison's not inspired. Economy starts to slow down. Mm-hmm. The Democratic Party is pissed off, as you might imagine, because they won the popular vote, lost the electoral vote. Grover Cleveland, young enough now to, because he was elected president at the age of in his late 40s, could run again and did in 1892
with a guy named Adlai Stevenson as his running mate.
You know why he got rid of his former vice president, Morton, the guy he ran with 4 years before? Why? Not 4 years, but 8 years before, because Grover Cleveland passed legislation that would dampen down. It would just soften, not get rid of, but soften what we'd come to know as Jim Crow laws in the South, and give some kind of franchise to freed slaves down there. His vice president worked behind the scenes. I'm not kidding, to kill the legislation. Yeah. I mean,
that is surprising for a Democrat. I mean, by most accounts, by the standards of the day, he was not racist. He let Frederick Douglass, this freed slave, famously keep his government job. And then when Douglass of his own accord left, he was replaced by another black man who was appointed by Cleveland. But it is, I mean, you know, back then the Democrats were the racist party of the South, and the Republicans were the party of Lincoln.
Yeah, and but so, being a Northerner, being a Yankee. Oh, I forgot this part, and it's fascinating. It's another fascinating tidbit. What did Stephen Grover Cleveland do during the Civil War? He was definitely of age. He was definitely healthy.
I know what he did. He did what all upstanding, patriotic defenders of the Union trying to keep America strong and together. He paid someone $150, which today would be about $4,000, to go and fight the war on his behalf, which was completely legal at the time. What I don't get is, okay, so the guy that he paid, would he not have had to go anyway? Didn't everyone have to go?
I think there was a conscription act, and I'm not sure if it was structured.
Was it a lottery or?
I think it was, if I'm remembering correctly, and God knows if we haven't, just let us know, because I'm more than willing to say I made a mistake. My understanding was it was a conscription, not conscription, and it was based on a lottery. So the guy may or may not have had to go.
Fortunately for him, he did survive.
But there's another comparison between him and Trump.
Yeah, they're both draft dodgers.
Yes, no bone spurs, but apparently they forgave him by the 1880s and elected him president 2.5 times. 1892, and
well, rich guys all paid to get out of it at the time, right? I mean, that wasn't.
Some did, some didn't. I mean, like you had especially officers who and gentlemen of a certain standing went on to, you know, they served as officers. Some of them were killed. Many of them were injured.
Many of them bought their way out. They're like, I have other things I'd rather be doing.
Up to that point, most of the presidents who were elected had served as officers in the Civil War. Grant, of course, Hayes, Garfield, they'd all served as officers in on the Union side. So, you know, it's so I thought that was an interesting little, like, another comparison between Grover Cleveland and Donald Trump, that, you know, non-consecutive terms, something has to do with being a draft dodger. Anyway, so we have a rematch, Ted, 1892.
Yeah, how did that come to be that, like, they decided to go back to him?
Well, you know, what's funny is Cleveland got the nomination.
What did he do for 4 years? What did he do during the Harrison years?
Well, apparently made babies, because he had 6 children.
Oh, right.
With his you know, baby mama there. And so Benjamin Harrison really didn't want to be president. He kind of was like, I'm not sure I want to run again. They talked him into it. The Republicans weren't so hot for him. Like I said, he was a weak candidate 4 years before. He was weaker now that he'd actually been president. Grover Cleveland comes forward, and he still had
nominated on the first ballot. Very unusual at that time.
Yeah. And so Cleveland comes and he wins. He wins handily. But like you said, the election, we call it now the Panic of 1893.
Correct.
Back then, you know what they called it?
The Depression of 1893.
The Great Depression, because it was really, really bad. It wasn't as bad as the soonish to come in 35 years, the Greater Depression. Maybe they should have done that.
Yeah, even better.
So Cleveland, so he's lording over, all of a sudden, his second term, the worst economy in U.S. history. The election of 1896 rolls around, and Grover Cleveland seriously toyed with the idea of running again. That would have been a fourth run for the presidency by Grover Cleveland,
which was not against the law at that time.
No, of course not. The 22nd Amendment wasn't going to.
It was just
not be passed until the
it was
50s,
simply a matter of
1950s.
tradition. It was simply a matter of tradition. I don't really know why.
Well, it also is kind of weird because you had a president who'd had 2 non-consecutive terms. Now, people ask, can Donald Trump run again in 4 years, presuming he's alive? And
the answer is no.
The answer is no, because the 22nd Amendment, as I understand it, and it has been explained by people far smarter than me, is that the president can only serve 2 terms. It doesn't say anything about consecutive.
They could be 40 years apart, but
right,
8 years total. That's it.
So
so the longest you can conceivably stretch is if like a vice president ascends to the presidency, let's say after a year. Let's say
John Tyler.
Let's say Vance decides to kill Trump and becomes president. Then he could run 2 more times, and that he'd be a president for 11 years.
Yeah, potentially. So 1896, Cleveland was thinking and was actually considered at the Democratic Convention. Frankly, I'm not sure Grover Cleveland doesn't beat William McKinley because he was not a silver guy. 1896.
He did have to balance his ticket, right, in 1892 with Adlai. Adlai Stevenson was the grandfather of the 1952 and 56 Democratic candidate for president?
Yes.
Okay.
And he was a silver man. But Grover Cleveland, to his credit, felt that this balanced the ticket. But Cleveland was not. He was a gold standard guy, solid, sound money. And so running against McKinley, that was really the issue in 1896 with the ascent of William Jennings Bryan, with his phenomenal cross of gold speech, you shall not crucify the working man on the cross of gold. And that essentially, elevated William Jennings Bryan to the nomination. He was 36 years old, by the way. He makes J.D. Vance look like like
an old fart,
like a geezer. Yeah, it was kind of incredible. So Grover Cleveland, the only other president to serve 2 terms, he was our 22nd and 24th president, elected in 1884, and elected in 1892. Now we've repeated history with Donald Trump, who was obviously the 45th and will be sworn in January as the 47th president of the United States.
That's very cool. I mean, is there, Grover Cleveland, I mean, by the way, is the city of Cleveland named after him, or?
I don't think so.
Okay.
We'd have to look that up.
Okay.
People, you can go Google that. I do not, I believe, because I'm looking at Ohio was obviously a state for decades by the time Grover Cleveland gets born, let alone becomes, national prominence.
Yes. I am looking that up because I just really want to know how it got its name. Okay. So, it is named by someone else, by General Moses Cleveland, who
of course
is spelled a little differently. I don't know if there's any relationship between Grover and I doubt it.
Well, Grover Cleveland was born in New Jersey, by the way. He was not born in New York. His family moved up there. And so fascinating guy, interesting guy, weird guy. But I mean, I've just described every president we've ever had. I don't know that is there a president that comes to mind like that you would say was normal?
Ooh, that's a really good question. Or maybe more to the point, who was the most normal president?
Yeah, I would say, I would, if I could jump in, I would say please. Coolidge.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Coolidge was married, had a solid marriage, had children.
He was like an executive. He was almost like a business executive.
Yeah. And, but he also served his entire career as a public servant, interestingly.
I would say Gerald Ford, even though he wasn't elected.
Yeah, but he was also minority leader in the House for many years. So
he's normal personality-wise.
Personality-wise, yeah, you would like him. Yeah, you would like him. He was likable.
And he doesn't have a lot of, there's nothing strange like, he was addicted to potatoes or something.
Well, we all have our quirks. Come on. And they all
Yeah.
get magnified. Now, if you were elected president or I was elected president, there would be stuff that would come out that's like, man, that's bizarre. That
Yeah, for sure.
That's weird.
They would totally say that about you, Scott.
Well,
you.
yeah, because
about you, not me. You.
I understand. No, I'm agreeing with you. I mean, yeah, the Gregorian chant president. What was up with that?
Yeah, like his taste in music is execrable.
Yeah, it was just weird, man.
And I think I might have the coolest taste in music if I were elected president.
Maybe
of any president. Yeah. That'd probably be the only thing I had going for me. So Grover Cleveland's legacy, does he have much of one?
I think that his legacy probably stems from his honesty. Mm-hmm. He ran the government extremely,
notwithstanding what he did to the mother of his child.
Well, there's that. Of his 6 children, let's be clear. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, 7 if you count the one,
Yeah, he kind of Hunter Biden'd her. But anyway, all right.
Yeah.
The first one.
So what is his legacy? He was like I said, he cleaned up the government of New York. He cleaned up government that, when you have one party rule. Listen, I draw for the Chicago Tribune. Democratic Party has a supermajority in both houses. It controls the governorship there, all of the constitutional offices. One party rule is not great. I live in Alabama. Republican Party controls this, all the constitutional officers, has supermajorities in both of the legislatures, House of the Legislature. So it's bad. So Grover Cleveland comes into office where Republicans have been in charge now, had won consecutive presidential elections since 1860. And, corruption creeps in. It's inevitable when you have one party rule. And it did. He stepped forward and cleaned it up. And I say that was his legacy.
In the 19th century, being a reformer who ran an honest federal government without shit tons of patronage was extremely difficult.
It was.
And I mean, like Chester Arthur famously did that after he ascended to the presidency after the assassination of Garfield. He was an amazing reformer, but you can count them on the fingers of one hand, really.
Chester Arthur, shocking that he was a reformer, given that he was a product of a spoils system, was kind of given the vice presidency as a political.
He knew it from the inside and just said, "Fuck it." It's very analogous to LBJ, pushing through the Civil Rights Act after being, such a, imbued with racism and allied with racists in the Senate, but he saw racism from the inside out and then turned against it violently.
And God bless him for doing it. So what other legacies does Grover Cleveland have? I don't know that there are, overt. I mean, they're obviously.
He's kind of forgotten, right? I mean, most people don't really know much about him anymore.
And I think that's probably what he wanted. I think in terms of the legacy is he was a good, solid, honest public servant. And one of the other reasons he lost in 1888 is he, as you mentioned, Ted, he ignored the spoils system. He did not appoint political cronies to those offices, but rather people who were, qualified to do the job. And that, and the people in the Democratic Party were like, I worked for you. I deserve to be the port commissioner of Charleston. I deserve to be the postmaster of, New Brunswick or whatever. I mean, not New Brunswick's in Canada. That would be a bridge too far for patronage, maybe. But I think that's his legacy, is that he was a profoundly honest, solid, classically liberal, very racially tolerant, almost subversively so. Mm-hmm. Tried to get the country and indeed his party to move away from Jim Crow, away from
while at the same time trying to unify and bring and reintegrate the South into the Union, which continued
to be a pain in their ass.
Oh, it's not fully integrated now.
No, tell me about it. It was so funny. We were just talking about Janine and my wife Janine and I were talking about if the South decided to secede again. I bet you Northerners would say, go ahead.
Yeah, I bet they would.
Yeah, this time you're free to go.
See ya.
But that's the legacy of Grover Cleveland, which makes it a great legacy that he doesn't really have a strong legacy. Do you know what I mean? It says that he did the job right. He did it without pretense, and he did it honestly, and was a good steward for the people until the economy went complete and utterly tits up in the first year of his second term.
Yeah,
but there's that.
And that was, I mean, that is, again, an episode that is largely forgotten. I mean, look, it could boil down to Americans don't have much memory of 19th century history anymore, really at all. It seems almost like for people who know history, that kind of starts around Theodore Roosevelt, maybe, or FDR.
No, we don't. No, Ted, I'm sorry. We had a pandemic in 2020. You may have heard about this. We did not learn a goddamn thing from the pandemic, the Spanish flu of 1918. And we didn't, nothing.
Well, actually, I could say we did learn all the bad things. Like, for example, 6-foot social distancing was copied and pasted from the response to the 1918 Spanish flu. And they just made that up at the time. There was no science behind it at all. And we just revived it in 2020 just because.
Well, and the masks, we didn't have a protocol, and this is Trump's fault. And we're going to pay the price for this again.
In the Spanish flu people
they did, but they realized it didn't do anything.
Right. There's by the way, amazing photo of families, black and white family during the Spanish flu, and even their pets are wearing masks.
Well, remember when the pandemic first started to bloom, and we were thinking, can you get it from your pets? Can your dog spread it? Mm-hmm. It turns out that they probably could in a very peculiar way.
Don't you remember a tiger got it at the Bronx Zoo?
The disease is born of aerosols, and that. But going back to Grover Cleveland, we don't remember him. I mean, James K. Polk, in my mind, is one of the great presidents of the United States. Single-term president. He ran on a very strict. Democrats, are you listening to this? A very specific list of things he wanted to accomplish. He accomplished all of them, and then said, "You know what? I'm done. You guys win. I did what I came to do. I'm done." He did it in a single term. Yeah. He's another one who was not debauched. He did not serve alcohol in his White House. Mm-hmm. So we have to learn from these guys, and we don't, because we don't study the history that we should. That's why we're doing this. Ted, before we wrap this up, I want to ask you a question, and I'll answer it after you do. You are editorial cartoonist. You're working for Puck, and I'm working for Judge. Do you support Grover Cleveland in 1884, 1888, or 1892? Would you, given what you know about his policies?
I would have had problems with the, I would have opposed him because of the free trade policies.
Yeah.
I would have been on Team Blaine, and I would have totally been, I would have been a Silverist. I would have been like,
really?
I would have been like, coin that money.
Really?
William Jennings Bryan, go for it. Adlai Stevenson, do it. Yeah, then I think I would have definitely, I think it would have been something we don't see anymore, where you get to, like, when I voted against George H.W. Bush in both 1988 and 1992, I nevertheless always thought that it wouldn't be the end of the world if he won. And he did win, and it didn't freak me out or anything. Voting against Grover Cleveland would have felt like that to me, I think. Like, he's not a bad guy. It'll be okay. It's fine. And it's kind of like, those are good elections. Those are the elections you want to participate in. That's not the election we just had here in the United States. But
no, absolutely not. I would have been weirdly, if I was cartoony back then, I would have drawn positively for Grover Cleveland. I mean, gold standard, low tariffs, free trade, libertarian, before there really was defined what that was. I mean, Grover Cleveland hits all of my hot buttons, man. I would love this guy.
Benjamin Harrison, protection every time.
Yep. Yeah.
And manly beard.
It was a good beard. He really did have a good beard.
Grover Cleveland was the human embodiment of a human walrus. He looks exactly like a walrus.
I think Hayes fits that mold more. His mustache was phenomenal. It went down to.
Hayes has this, like, pointiness. He's got like a ZZ Top situation happening with his beard. All right. Well, anyway, look, Scott, this is fascinating. And anyway, so if you want to learn more about Grover Cleveland, go to there are really good history books about him.
Yeah.
But I would say start out with books about the 1876 election, because that's really where this whole story starts.
Absolutely.
All right, Scott, where can everybody find your all things Scott Stantisian?
Go to gocomics.com/Scott Stantis, one word, or go to gocomics.com/Prickly City to see my political cartoon. You can go to the Chicago Tribune opinion section, see the work I do for them, or go to the Dallas Morning News, see the work I do for them, or go to smirkonish.com and look at the work I do for him and CNN. In addition, I do a little thing called Center Clip, which is mini podcasts, 30 seconds, no longer than 5 minutes. Ted and I both do them. It's a fantastic way to kind of get an amalgam. You can build your own slate of contributors who you want to listen to, and they're from the left, the right, the center, and it's really a great place to go for immediate responses to breaking news stories.
True.
So, Ted, where can we see all things Rawlian?
Please go to Ted Rall online. That's rawl.com. You can check out my kind of new book at this point. Buy it now until I get my new book out, in which case 2024 Revisited. You can go to the TMI show Monday through Friday with me and Manila Chan. Streams live 10 a.m. Eastern, but you can get it anytime.
On where?
YouTube or Rumble are the best places to find it. If you forget, just go to raw.com. And I have cartoon at whowhatwhy.org. And I have cartoons at gocomics.com/Ted Rall. Creator Syndicate syndicates my column. And thanks everybody so much for watching and listening to us here on the DMZ America podcast. Please hit that subscribe button on Rumble and YouTube. Please support us. We're trying to build this up into something real and viable. So if you like what you hear, please support it. If you don't like what you hear, support it anyway. It's that kind of world. All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye, Scott.
Bye, Ted. Vote for Cleveland. Vote for Cleveland.
Ha, ha. Where did he go? Ha, ha, ha.
Well, he's dead.